Hello, I'm Anika from Made to Sew. In this tutorial, I'm going to be sharing with you how to make these cute little birds. And obviously we've designed them in time for Easter. You can hang them on a tree, you can display them around your home, it's really up to you. We're going to then launch a corresponding tutorial later on in the week to make these Easter eggs, in case you wanted to make some eggs too. So, today is all about the birds. So what are you going to need to create them? The first thing is that you're going to need the pattern, and the pattern can be downloaded free of charge from my website. I'll pop a link to that in the description box below. You're also going to need some fabric. Now you can see by the ones that we've done here that we used Liberty Tana Lawn fabrics, and we sort of worked with different prints and put them together, which is quite a fun way of doing it. So cotton or perhaps lightweight upholstery fabric, that would be perfect. You're going to need fabric for the main body and for the wings. You're going to need to have some ribbon or something to be able to hang the birds from if you want to do that. You're going to need some toy stuffing to fill them inside. Usual things such as thread, perhaps some embroidery thread if you want to make the eyes stand out. And finally, slightly optional, we actually quilted the wings just to give a nice finish and to give them some support. We used a lightweight cotton wadding. If you decide not to quilt the wings, then you might find that you need to use some interfacing just to support them. Now in terms of sewing tools, it's going to be your usual sewing tools, a sewing machine, some scissors, and perhaps an unpicker in case you go wrong, and you'll be good to go. So I hope you enjoy the tutorial, and I hope that you have fun making these. Now stay tuned over the coming weeks because I promise I'll be back with some fun dressmaking tutorials and a free dressmaking pattern very soon. We're going to begin with our fabric with the wrong side facing up. Give this a quick iron if you need to prior to starting. You're then going to take the template. I have drawn out my template in card, and you may find it easier to do this too because we're going to be drawing around the template. Now if you remember, the template doesn't have any seam allowances, so you need to make sure that you position it on the fabric with enough space to add 1/4 inch or 5mm of seam allowance all the way around. You also want to think about how the bird is sitting on the print. If your print is larger than this, you may want to position it in a certain way. Then you're going to hold down the template and you're simply going to trace around it with chalk or a removable pen, something that will easily come off because we're tracing the stitching line here. You need to make sure that you mark the notches. There's one notch at the top for attaching the ribbon and 2 notches at the bottom edge here, and these are the opening that we're going to leave open when sewing the bird. Once you're happy that you've drawn all the way around the shape, we then need to add a seam allowance because if you remember, the pattern doesn't have seam allowances with it. Now we're going to need to add 1/4 inch or 5mm. And you're going to want to do that with either a ruler or a tape measure. You're simply going to measure 1/4 inch, 5mm from the previous drawn line, and you can work your way around adding that. So I have drawn around one bird shape and I've added my 1/4 inch or 5mm seam allowance. You now need to do the other side of the bird. And to do that, you're going to need to turn the template over so that you're creating 2 opposite sides. Again, you're going to need to trace around the outside as the stitching line, mark the notches, check how you position the template on your fabric if that's important to you, and then add the 1/4 inch 5mm seam allowance. You then simply need to cut around the exterior line, which is your seam allowance line, and you should have 2 opposite shapes. Now we need to create the wings, and you need to create 2 opposite wings for each of the birds that you want to make. You don't have to quilt them like I've done here, but it can add a little bit of structure and it gives a little bit of a design detail to the birds, but that's simply up to you. If you want to quilt the fabric, you only need to quilt one side of the fabric, so it's going to be the front on both sides. The back of this is plain. We completed the quilting lines 1/4 inch, 5mm apart, and we just used a cotton wadding, a very soft, lightweight cotton wadding to give a little bit of support. If you use anything too thick, you'll find that it's hard to turn this around to the right side. If you want to know how we quilted this, I'll pop a link in the description box below to our quilting tutorial. So you can see that I've cut the wing out in card. One wing is looking like this, so this wing needs to be this way. Okay, so what we're going to do is we've got another piece of fabric here that's plain. We're going to position the right side of the fabric pieces together. And you can pop a pin in that if you want to hold it together. I would recommend that you pin at the edges because we're going to be drawing around our wing template in a second. Now we're going to take the template, and we know that we want to create it this way. And we're going to draw around this just like we did with the bird. Draw around the wing using your removable pen and mark the notches. Again, there are 2 notches on the bottom edge. This is the opening that we're going to leave to turn the wing around. Once you're happy with that, you want to make sure that you can see the line. We're not going to add any seam allowances to this because it's quite a small, sort of fiddly little piece. We're simply going to go to the sewing machine and we're going to stitch along the line that we have drawn. We're going to start at the 1 notch, stitch all the way around till we get to the other notch, leaving an opening between the notches at the bottom edge. So I'm going to begin at the notch on the bottom, and I'm going to backstitch. So a couple of stitches forwards, a couple of stitches backwards to secure that opening. I'm now going to work my way along, and I'm aiming to stitch on the line that I have drawn. Unfortunately, I'm not sure how clear it is on the video, but I've got a blue line with my removable pen that comes off with water. And I'm just feeding that into the foot, the centre of the foot where I've got a red dot where the needle is. When I get to the top part here, the sort of the wing part or the point of the wing, you're going to position the needle in, and I'm going to lift the foot and turn. Okay. And I'm going to work my way, continuing around until I get to the opposite notch where I will complete another back stitch. Now you can do this in your normal stitch length, or if you want a little bit more security, you can turn the stitch length down like I have done to 1.5 millimeters. So now I've completed the stitching around the wing, and I've stitched from 1 notch all the way around to the other notch. I now need to trim my seam allowances down so that I can turn this around to the right side. So as you can see, we obviously didn't add any seam allowance, we just positioned it on, drew a stitching line, and we stitched along that. So we now want to trim to quite close to the stitching line. I would recommend about 1/8, 3 millimeters away, something like this, because any more and you'll have too much bulk in the wing. Work your way all the way around the shape. You can leave a little bit of a larger seam allowance where the opening is between the 2 notches, perhaps 1/4 inch or 5 millimeters, just so that you have something to work with, because we're going to have to hand sew that. Now the point here, you can cut straight across to try and reduce the bulk. And as I near the bottom, I'm just going to leave myself a bit of a larger seam allowance on that bottom opening there. Now you've got the challenge of turning this around to the right side, and this is super fiddly. It's also why we had to backstitch at the start and at the end of the opening to make sure that the whole thing didn't come undone. Just start gradually and continue working with it until you have it all turned around in a nice finish. I recommend using a point turner or something that you can get inside with. You can use a pencil if you want to. Just be careful if you choose to use something like a pair of scissors, because you could easily slip. And just keep working your way around. You may need to be quite forceful with the point of the tail to make sure that this really comes out, but try and be sure that you don't actually push through your stitching. This is why it can be a good idea to stitch this with a smaller stitch length of 1.5 millimeters. Once you've turned it around to the right side, then you're going to need to tuck in the seam allowances that you left at the bottom opening. Now you may find that these are slightly too large now, so I probably need to trim mine down a little bit, just so that I've got less to tuck inside. You're then going to fold under both sides, so the plain side and the quilted side, if you've decided to quilt this. If you decided not to quilt the wings, you may find, depending on your fabric, that you need a little bit of interfacing just to support them and make sure that they have a nice shape and structure. Now keep working with this until you're happy with it, and then you can hold this opening in place with a pin. We're going to fasten this bottom edge with a little hand stitch. We're going to use a ladder stitch, and I'll pop a link to a separate tutorial I have on that in the description box below. But let me show you quickly how to do that now. To complete the ladder stitch, you're going to want to have a needle and thread. Now I'm using a different colour thread, a red thread, so that you can hopefully see this more clearly. But as I mentioned, I've got a link to a tutorial that I do this in detail, so please follow that if you're new to the ladder stitch. Start off by fastening the thread on one side of the opening and try and hide your fastening. You're then simply going to work from opening to opening. So the thread has come out on the edge of the quilted opening. I'm going to go directly opposite into the edge of the non-quilted opening. And I'm going to go along the edge of the fabric and pull that through. And you want to go along for about 1/8 or 3 millimeters. Keep the stitches quite close together. Then the thread has come out on the edge of the fold of the non-quilted layer. You want to go directly opposite, in and out of the opposite folded layer, which in my case is quilted. So you're working from side to side, going in and out of the folded edges. The key to making this invisible is to make sure that when you do your next stitch, you must go directly opposite. I'm going to leave you to have a go. Alternatively, watch the corresponding tutorial. Once you've completed that, you can tie off and try and make sure that it's as discreet as possible. Obviously, you'll use a thread colour that works and is invisible with your fabric. Now, once you've completed one wing, you're going to do exactly the same for the wing on the opposite side, trying to keep the shape as similar as possible. You should have 2 opposite wings when you are finished. Now I'm ready to actually sew the bird together. Now, my personal preference is to attach the wings once the bird has been made. Obviously, you can attach them with a hand stitch, and that is pretty much invisible. If you want to speed up the process, then you are welcome to attach them now. I would use the template to mark the wing position onto the bird, and you can stitch on the sewing machine around the outside of the wing. I'd recommend that you only do this at the front section, the front curved section of the wing. You don't need to do it all the way around. But the process that I'm going to show you is to leave the wings for now and to sew the birds together and hand sew them on afterwards. So now it's time to actually sew the bird together. You're also going to need a piece of ribbon or something that you can use for hanging the bird. This needs to be 6 inches long, 15 centimetres, or approximately. So what we're going to do now is to take the bird and we're going to position these right sides together. Now we also need to position our hanging loop inside the bird. So you're going to fold this in half with the right side on the outside if you have one. You're going to want to match the ribbon to the notch. The notch marking is on the wrong side of my fabric, but I can keep checking that it is in the right place. And just pin that in place. You want to make sure that the ribbon is on the same angle as the notch, so that the edge of the ribbon is flush and flat with the fabric. Now we'll leave that pin there for a second while we position the 2 layers together. So we're positioning the 2 layers together, and you're going to use your pins to work all the way around. Now, if you've cut out the 2 layers that I have here, you can use the pins to match the stitching lines together. So I can position the pin through on the stitching line of the point of the beak on the one side and check that it's in the correct place on the point of the beak on the other side. And that can just help with accuracy. Now this would be especially important if you decided to sew the wings onto the bird on the sewing machine, because you would want to make sure that the placement you laid out flat would be the same as when the bird is finished. Now a slightly easier method, just so that you know, is that you could cut out and draw around one side of the bird. The other side of the bird could simply be a piece of flat fabric, right sides together, a bit like what we did for the wing. You would stitch following the drawn line, the drawn stitching line on the one side of the cutout bird, and the other side would just be, as I said, a flat piece of fabric that you would then trim down afterwards. Just something to think about. Now, I'd also recommend that you remove the pin holding the ribbon from the inside and position that through all of the layers now so that everything is nicely held in place. If you are worried about sewing this, you can by all means tack or baste it in place. Or you could simply just do that for the ribbon so that that didn't move while you sewed the rest of it. It's up to you and your sewing ability. Now we're going to go to the sewing machine. We've got the 2 notches on the bottom edge. We're going to start at 1 notch, work our way all the way around and stop at the other notch. We must backstitch to secure the stitching just like we did with the wing at the notches along the bottom. So I'm starting at the 1 notch and I'm going to stitch backwards and forwards to secure that. I'm going to take my pins out as I go and I'm aiming to stitch along that stitching line all the time, and that's why we drew it on, because we want there to be some accuracy here. We want the birds that you make to all come out the same shape and size. And I'm working with a 1.5mm stitch length. You'll probably find that that is easier to work with, especially when we're trimming and turning this around to the right side. It just makes it a little bit more secure. Now, you may find the curves on the bird mean that there are times when you need to position the needle down, you need to lift the foot and reposition the fabric. And you'll definitely need to do that for the points at the beak and at the tail. So my needle goes into my fabric here, lift and twist. Take that pin out, and you're just going to work all the way around. When you near the ribbon, just make sure that you are catching it and it's staying in position, and make sure that you don't sew the ribbon in place anywhere else around the bird. When you get back to the other notch, you can backstitch again. Now, hopefully you can see the stitching that I have done around the shape of the bird. You can always check this against the template to check that you are correct before moving on. And obviously, if you're incorrect, you can unpick it or redo it. So, when you're ready to move on, the next step is to trim down the seam allowances. Although we've got small seam allowances, you'll find that they'll add too much bulk if you leave them like this. So just like with the wing, we're going to trim them down to 1/8 or 3mm all the way around. You are welcome, however, to leave a larger seam allowance like we did with the wing, and for this you can leave the seam allowance as it is at the opening at the bottom edge between the 2 notches. This will just help when you're having to sew this up afterwards. For any of the points, the beak and the tail here, you can cut off the corners of the fabric, and this will give us a nice point when we turn it around. At the top edge, where you have the ribbon, I would recommend that you just trim down the fabric on either side and not the ribbon. This just gives a little bit of security so that the ribbon doesn't actually pop out of the seam. Now, once you've trimmed the bird shape, you can turn it around through the gap at the bottom. Again, this is a little bit fiddly like it was for the wing, but just be patient and keep working the fabric through. Now, you can use a point turner again to poke out all of the points and to sort of smooth out the shape. Use the point turner to poke out the shape, especially the tail and the nose. If you find that you're not getting a very good shape, then it's probably because you haven't trimmed the seam allowances small enough or cut off the corners. So go back in and do that. Feel free to give the shape an iron prior to adding the stuffing if you feel you need to. Start by adding small amounts of stuffing so that you can really get these into the nose and the tail. Then you can start adding more, and you can use the point turner if you want to help you sort of get it all inside. Keep working your way, adding the stuffing. You will probably need more stuffing in here than you think you do. You want to add enough stuffing until you're happy with the firmness of the bird. Once you're happy with that, you can sew up the hole along the bottom edge using the same ladder stitch that we used when sewing up the bottom of the wings. I'll leave you to do that, and then you can join me back here and we're going to sew the wings on, and we're also going to create a French knot for the eye. Now it's time to place the wings in position. You can refer back to the template to see where we designed the wings to go, or you can simply position them where you would like. It's really up to you. Hold them in place with some pins and just double check that both of the wings are going to be the same. So you can have a look at the placement on one side and then on the other side and check that you're doing it as symmetrically as possible. Now we're going to sew these on. We're going to hand stitch them on. You're going to stitch just around the front curve of the wing. We want the back to sort of be not sewn so that it sort of sticks out like the bird is flying. Now I've chosen to work with a thread that I hope you can see, whereas you're going to be working with a thread that is inconspicuous with your fabric. So I've tied a knot at the bottom and I can simply go in and out behind the wing a couple of times to secure it, to secure the thread to begin. Okay, so now what we're going to do, starting about here, we're going to work our way around to the bottom of the curve. So you're simply going to catch the edge of the wing, and it wants to be right along the edge there. And then you're going to go directly above where you've come out on the edge of the wing into the fabric of the bird and along by about 1/8 millimeters and out on the edge of the fabric of the wing again. Remove that pin. Okay, so we've come out on the edge of the wing directly opposite into the fabric of the bird, along and out on the edge of the wing again. Just like so. We've come out on the edge of the wing directly opposite into the bird, along and coming out on the edge of the wing again. Now with your thread, this shouldn't be visible. I would have chosen a white thread, but I went with red so that it was nice and hopefully clearer for you. So you keep working all the way until you get to about here, and then we will tie that off with a knot or stitch over yourself to fasten and end the stitching. And my stitching has finished here, so I've tied that off with a knot and I'll trim the threads, and this part of the wing isn't sewn down. Now the final thing that we need to do, obviously you'll do this to both sides, is to sew an eye onto the bird. You could do that with a bead or perhaps a button, or you could do that with a French knot, which is what I tend to use. I'm going to show you how to do that now. Start by deciding where you want the eye to be and make sure it's symmetrical on both sides of the bird. I'm using embroidery floss here to make sure that the eye stands out. I've got 2 or 3 threads through the eye of my needle. Sew over yourself a couple of times to secure where you want the French knot to go. Then hold the needle in your right hand and use the left hand to wrap the thread once, twice, 3 times, so 2 or 3 times around the needle. You're going to want to hold with the left hand this firm as you complete the next stitch. Not too tight, but just give a little bit of tension against the stitch. Now you're going to position the needle into the fabric where you want the French knot to go. You don't want to go down the same hole that you just came out of with your stitching, but you want to be close to that. And then you want to take the needle through to perhaps the seam at the top here, so it's out of the way. Keep the tension with the left hand and pull that through. And that will give you a beautiful French knot. Now I will film a detailed French knot tutorial just so that you can see this in fabrics that stand out a little bit more and to go over it a few times. I'll pop a link to that in the description box below. Fasten your stitching at the seam and you can trim that off. And there you have it, your finished bird. I really hope you've enjoyed this tutorial and that you've learned some new techniques along the way. Thanks for watching and see you soon. Good luck with your sewing.